While Washington's foreign policy establishment congratulates itself on what it calls the Pacific Reset, a sweeping realignment of American trade, security, and technology policy across 14 nations spanning the Indo-Pacific, the real battle is being waged not in diplomatic conference rooms in Manila or Tokyo, but in the procurement offices of Chinese state enterprises quietly absorbing every market gap the reset creates. The numbers tell a story that no one in the State Department wants to read aloud. And by 2027, those numbers will have rewritten the economic geography of an entire hemisphere. Let that sink in for a moment. Here is the contradiction at the heart of the Pacific Reset. The Biden administration positioned it as the most ambitious American strategic re-engagement with Asia since the Nixon-Kissinger opening to China in 1972. The architecture included the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, 14 member nations, a combined GDP of $49 trillion representing 40% of global economic output. The framework promised modernized labor standards, digital trade rules, clean energy supply chains, and coordinated export controls targeting Chinese semiconductor ambitions. On paper, this is the most muscular economic statecraft the United States has deployed in a generation. But here is what the framework excluded: market access, tariff reduction, the one mechanism that every Asian finance minister, trade economist, and corporate procurement officer actually cares about. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework offered rules without rewards, obligations without incentives, burden sharing without the singular benefit that Asian economies actually require: access to 335 million American consumers. Without that, the framework is a diplomatic document dressed as an economic strategy. That gap between what Washington promised and what Asian capitals actually need is precisely the opening that Beijing has been engineering for 3 years. Chapter 1. The Arithmetic of Abandonment. Start with the numbers that define the baseline. The 14 nations of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework conduct $1 trillion in annual trade with China. That same group conducts $7 trillion in annual trade with the United States. The gap is not enormous, but the trajectory matters more than the snapshot. Between 2020 and 2024, Chinese trade with Indo-Pacific Framework member states grew at an average annual rate of 3%. American trade with those same nations grew at 1%. At those divergent rates, by 2027, China's trade relationship with Pacific Reset member nations will exceed American trade by a ratio approaching 2-to-1. Think about what that means structurally. When a Vietnamese textile manufacturer, a Malaysian semiconductor assembly plant, or a Filipino agricultural exporter faces a choice between optimizing for the Chinese market versus the American market, the arithmetic increasingly favors Beijing. Not because of ideology, not because of political alignment, because of volume, proximity, and the absence of meaningful tariff reduction from Washington. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework launched in May 2022 with considerable ceremony. 14 nations, 4 pillars: trade, supply chains, clean economy, fair economy. What it did not include, and what the Association of Southeast Asian Nations Secretariat noted with diplomatic restraint in its 2023 assessment, was any binding commitment to lower American tariffs on goods from member states. The Peterson Institute for International Economics calculated in a 2023 analysis that without market access provisions, the framework's economic benefit to member nations was approximately 1% of GDP annually. For context, the Trans-Pacific Partnership that the Biden administration chose not to rejoin would have delivered an estimated 1% GDP gain to member economies. The difference between 1% and 1% does not sound dramatic in isolation. Translate it into actual dollars for a nation like Vietnam, whose GDP in 2024 reached approximately $430 billion. The Trans-Pacific Partnership delivered the equivalent of $7 billion annually in economic benefit. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework delivered $430 million. The choice between those numbers is not a diplomatic abstraction. It is a corporate investment decision made by every multinational manufacturer deciding where to locate their next production facility. Here is what keeps trade economists up at night. The nations that most need American market access, Vietnam, Indonesia, Thailand, the Philippines, are the precise nations where Chinese infrastructure investment, manufacturing partnerships, and trade relationships are expanding most aggressively. The United States offered a framework that required institutional reforms and regulatory alignment without compensating those nations for the economic adjustment costs those reforms impose. China offered infrastructure financing through the Belt and Road Initiative, preferential trade terms through the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, and manufacturing partnerships that transfer technology and create local employment. Chapter 2. The Semiconductor Miscalculation. Now trace what happens when the Pacific Reset meets its most critical test case, semiconductors. The Biden administration's semiconductor strategy rested on a coherent logic. Restrict China's access to advanced chip manufacturing equipment and design software. Subsidize American and allied semiconductor production through the CHIPS and Science Act, 52. $7 billion in direct funding. Coordinate export controls with the Netherlands, Japan, and South Korea to prevent circumvention. Build a trusted supply chain that excludes Chinese participation at the most sensitive nodes. The strategy has produced measurable results and catastrophic, unintended consequences simultaneously. On the results side, TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, broke ground on its Arizona fabrication facility in December 2022. Samsung accelerated its Texas expansion. Intel received $5 billion in CHIPS Act direct funding for fabrication facilities in Ohio and Arizona. The Congressional Budget Office estimated in 2024 that the CHIPS Act would add approximately 115,000 semiconductor manufacturing jobs to the American economy by 2030. Now examine what happened in Beijing in response. China's Semiconductor Self-Sufficiency Program, Made in China 2025, now operating under updated branding as the New Productive Forces Industrial Strategy, received a budget allocation that Western analysts initially underestimated by a factor of 3. The true figure, reconstructed from provincial government disclosures, central bank lending facilities, and state enterprise capital expenditure reports, exceeds $150 billion committed through 2027. That is 3 times the CHIPS Act. Deployed through mechanisms that do not require congressional approval, quarterly earnings guidance, or return on investment timelines that satisfy institutional investors. The result is visible in production data. China's domestic semiconductor production, which stood at 16% self-sufficiency in advanced logic chips in 2020, reached an estimated 26% by 2024, according to analysis published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies. The trajectory projects 41% self-sufficiency by 2027, not complete independence, but sufficient to insulate the Chinese economy from export control regimes that assume total dependency. But here is the mechanism that the Pacific Reset missed entirely. The export control strategy was designed to prevent China from acquiring the equipment needed to manufacture chips at 7 nanometer precision or below. ASML, the Dutch firm that makes the extreme ultraviolet lithography machines essential for sub-7 nanometer production, was restricted from selling its most advanced systems to Chinese customers. That restriction held. What it did not hold was the broader ecosystem. China has methodically acquired older generation equipment, the 28 nanometer and 40 nanometer technology that ASML's export controls did not initially cover, and is deploying it at a scale that compensates through volume for what it lacks in precision. Consider the following calculation. A 28 nanometer chip is not competitive with a 5 nanometer chip for smartphone processors or artificial intelligence accelerators. But for automotive electronics, industrial automation, defense systems, and the vast majority of commercial applications, 28 nanometer performance is entirely adequate. China's capacity expansion in legacy chip production is not a consolation prize. It is a deliberate strategy to capture the market segment where most actual economic value resides. Not the frontier chips that generate headlines, but the commodity chips that run the global economy. Chapter 3: The 2027 Collision Geometry. Here is where the trajectories converge into what one can only describe as a collision course. By 2027, three forces will intersect in ways that the Pacific Reset's architects appear not to have modeled. First, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the China-led trade bloc encompassing 15 nations, including all 10 ASEAN members, Australia, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea, will have been in full operation for 5 years. The Peterson Institute estimates its annual trade creation effect at $186 billion. These are not theoretical gains. They are supply chain reconfigurations, logistics investments, regulatory harmonization agreements, and preferential tariff arrangements that compound annually. Second, the 2026 American election cycle, regardless of outcome, will intensify protectionist pressure on trade policy. The political economy of American trade liberalization remains deeply unfavorable. Neither political party has demonstrated the capacity or willingness to offer the market access provisions that would make the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework economically meaningful to its member states. The framework's most ambitious pillar, binding trade commitments, remains the one pillar that American domestic politics cannot currently support. Third, China's Belt and Road Initiative infrastructure investments will reach operational completion across 17 major projects in Indo-Pacific Framework member nations by 2027. These are not abstract diplomatic relationships. They are ports, rail lines, energy infrastructure, and digital networks that physically orient trade flows toward Chinese logistics systems. The Jakarta-Bandung high-speed railway, operational since 2023, the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka, the Kyaukphyu deepwater port in Myanmar. These are infrastructure assets that create structural dependencies independent of any trade agreement. The intersection of these three forces produces a specific geometric outcome. Nations that signed the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, facing no American tariff reductions, observing the deepening of Chinese trade relationships, and dependent on Chinese-financed infrastructure, will face mounting political pressure to accommodate Beijing's preferences in ways that contradict American strategic objectives. This is not speculation. The data points are already visible. Indonesia, the world's fourth most populous nation, a critical Indo-Pacific Economic Framework member, increased its trade with China by 2% in 2024, while signing 11 new bilateral investment agreements with Beijing. The Philippines, host to American military bases and a treaty ally, simultaneously negotiated joint development agreements with China in the South China Sea while maintaining its framework membership. Vietnam, the single nation most adversarial toward Chinese territorial claims, increased exports to China by 3% in 2024, driven by electronics manufacturing partnerships that American trade policy has failed to incentivize through its own market. Chapter 4: The Beneficiary Calculus. Now follow the money to its logical destination. China's economic position in the Indo-Pacific in 2027 will be structurally stronger than in 2022 when the Pacific Reset launched, for reasons that have nothing to do with Chinese diplomatic brilliance and everything to do with American strategic incoherence. The framework promised integration without offering the incentive that integration requires. It demanded regulatory alignment without providing the market access that justifies alignment costs. It asked allied and partner nations to accept friction in their Chinese relationships without compensating them for that friction. The result is not dramatic defection. Southeast Asian nations are experienced practitioners of strategic ambiguity, maintaining American security relationships while deepening Chinese economic relationships. What shifts is the balance of leverage. A nation whose trade depends 60% on China and 25% on the United States responds differently to American requests for export control compliance, for Huawei exclusion from telecommunications networks, for restrictions on Belt and Road participation. It responds with the arithmetic of dependency. Citigroup's Asia-Pacific Economic Research Team published an analysis in January 2025, projecting that by 2027, Chinese trade with Indo-Pacific Economic Framework member states will represent 3% of China's total global trade, up from 8% in 2022. That is not a marginal shift. It represents the consolidation of a regional economic architecture centered on Beijing rather than Washington, constructed not through coercion, but through the patient filling of every gap that American policy left open. Here is what this means for you personally. The products you buy, the supply chains that stock American shelves, the semiconductor content in your automobile, your appliances, your medical devices, these depend on the manufacturing decisions made in Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, and Thailand over the next 3 years. Those manufacturing decisions are being shaped right now by trade agreements, infrastructure investments, and market access provisions. The United States is participating in that competition with a framework that its own partner nations describe in private as diplomatically sincere but economically insufficient. The Pacific Reset does not fail dramatically. It fails gradually, one supply chain reconfiguration, one infrastructure concession, one trade agreement at a time, until the map of Asian economic alignment no longer resembles the map of American strategic intention. The historical parallel is instructive and uncomfortable. Britain's attempt to maintain imperial economic preference through the sterling bloc in the 1940s and 1950s was not defeated by a single dramatic event. It was eroded by the superior purchasing power of the American economy, which offered what sterling preference could not: actual market access, actual capital, actual technology transfer. The United States is now on the other side of that same structural dynamic, offering alliance commitments and regulatory frameworks to nations that need tariff reductions and investment flows. The 20,000 senior Chansimis Gachu 7 collision course is not between the United States and China in any direct military or diplomatic sense. It is between American strategic intentions and Asian economic realities, and economic realities win. They always win. The question for Washington is not whether to redesign the Pacific Reset. The question is whether the political system can generate the domestic consensus required to offer what partner nations actually need before the window closes. Based on the trajectory of American trade politics from 2016 through 2025, there is limited reason for optimism. And in Beijing, that calculation is understood precisely. The framework was always the wrong tool for the objective. And by 2027, the results will make that visible to everyone.